There's a thing about being invisible that most people get backwards. They think invisible means powerless. In my experience, invisible means you get to watch everything clearly, from a distance, without anyone performing for you. And what you see, when no one knows you're watching, tells you everything you'll ever need to know. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 63 years old. I drive a 2007 Holden Commodore with a busted rear speaker and a crack running along the bottom of the windscreen that my son has been telling me to get fixed since the last federal election. I wear a $15 Casio that I bought at a pharmacy in Dubbo sometime around 2009. My preferred outfit on any given Saturday morning is a gray flannel shirt, elastic waist work pants, and a pair of gardening boots I bought secondhand from the salvos. Walk past me in the driveway and you'd hand me a flyer for a lawn mowing service, not a business card. That's fine. That's always been fine. What most people don't know, and what I have never had any particular reason to advertise, is that for the last 19 years, I have been the sole owner of Whitmore Integrated Logistics, a freight and warehousing operation that moves product across the eastern seaboard, employs just over 3,000 people, and last financial year turned over a number that would rearrange the furniture in your mind if I said it out loud. We don't make headlines. We don't sponsor football teams or put our name on hospital wings. We just make sure that the things people ordered on Tuesday morning are sitting on their doorstep by Thursday afternoon, consistently, quietly, in every weather and every season. I built it from a single refrigerated van in 1998. I drove that van myself for the first 2 years. I know what it smells like at 3 in the morning on the Western Ring Road in July when the heater's broken and you've got 12 pallets of frozen seafood that need to be in Geelong by 5. I know because I was there. That history doesn't leave a man. It just goes quiet. My son Daniel is 31. He has his mother's eyes and, mercifully, her temperament. He's steady and considered, and the kind of person who thinks before he speaks, which in my observation is a quality that has become genuinely rare, and therefore genuinely valuable. He started working in the business at 24, not because I pushed him toward it, but because he asked, and when I tested him with the unglamorous end first scheduling, warehouse audits, driver liaison, he did it without complaint and did it well. By the time he was 28, I had made him state operations manager for New South Wales. He didn't know, at that point, that I owned the company. He knew I was connected to it. He did not know the full shape of that connection. I had reasons for that. I'll come to them. He met his wife, Renata, through a mutual friend at a barbecue in Marrickville about 4 years ago. She's a physiotherapist, warm, practical, honest in the way that some people are honestly without thinking about it. I liked her from the first afternoon. She shook my hand and looked me in the eye and asked me what I grew in my garden. And when I told her I was attempting tomatoes for the 3rd consecutive year with limited success, she laughed and said her grandmother had told her that tomatoes were the universe's way of keeping gardeners humble. Her parents were another matter. Renata's father, Dennis Carver, is 67. He spent 30 years as a senior manager in local government in the Hunter Valley and retired 4 years ago with the bearing of a man who believes his opinions are still subject to approval processes that no one else is aware of. He wears his watch on the outside of his cuff. I mention this only because it tells you something. He is the kind of man who wants you to know he is wearing a watch. His wife, Patricia, matches him in the way that long-married couples sometimes do not in personality exactly, but in posture, in the angle of the chin, in the particular readiness to be unimpressed. They have always been polite to me. Polite in the way that has a floor underneath it, the kind of polite that is really a form of patience, as though they are waiting for me to become someone more worth their time. When Daniel and Renata got engaged 2 years ago, Dennis shook my hand at the celebratory dinner and said, "Good to have Daniel in the family. He's a solid young man, Working in logistics, is that right? I said yes, that was right. He nodded in the way that people nod when they've categorized something and moved on. Patricia said the restaurant was very nice, and touched Renata's engagement ring with one finger and said it was sweet. I filed all of that away. I'm good at filing things away. Daniel and Renata married 14 months ago. Beautiful day. Renata in a dress that made Daniel go speechless for 4 seconds when she walked toward him, which I thought was exactly the right response. I wore a decent suit. I even bought a new tie. Dennis wore a tie clip and gave a speech that spent 7 of its 9 minutes discussing his own career in local government and 2 minutes mentioning his daughter. I sat with my glass of water and smiled the smile I have spent 63 years perfecting, which is the smile of a man who is filing things away. The trouble started gradually, then quickly, the way trouble usually does. About 7 months into the marriage, Daniel mentioned at Sunday lunch that Dennis had been calling Renata regularly with what he described as concerns. The concerns were, as best as Daniel could reconstruct them, as follows. Daniel's salary, while respectable, was not at the level Dennis felt appropriate for a man married to his daughter. Daniel's career prospects in logistics were, in Dennis's assessment, limited. And Daniel's father, that's me, in my Holden Commodore and my $15 watch was, based on available evidence, not in a position to provide the kind of family support and connection that Renata's future might benefit from. I listened to this while eating a roast potato. I said, "How's Renata handling it?" Daniel said she was getting increasingly frustrated, that she had told her father multiple times to let it go, that Dennis had a way of raising it indirectly through questions about their mortgage, their plans for children, their 5-year vision that made it hard to shut down cleanly. I said, "And you?" Daniel said he was fine. He said it, the way people say they're fine when they're deciding whether to be fine. I nodded. I thought about it. And then I did what I always do when something requires my full attention. I went very still and very quiet, and I began to pay close attention. What I observed over the following months was this. Dennis Carver had constructed a clear and confident view of the landscape. In his view, his daughter had married a decent but unremarkable man from a working-class background, whose father was a retired freight worker of no particular consequence. And while this was not a catastrophe, it was a disappointment that he was entitled to manage on her behalf. He was not malicious. That's important to say. He was not cruel. He was something in some ways harder to deal with, he was certain. Certain that he understood the situation completely. Certain that his experience and position gave him the perspective to assess it accurately. Certain, fundamentally, that the world arranged itself according to the categories he had established for it. He had never, not once in 4 years of knowing me, asked me a single question about my work beyond that first dinner. He had asked Daniel about his work a handful of times, always in a way that carried the faint suggestion that he was asking out of courtesy. He had never asked to visit the operation, never expressed interest in what the business actually did, never connected the name on the invoices and the fleet vehicles and the warehouses to the quiet man in the flannel shirt who grew tomatoes with limited success. Why would he? He already knew what I was. The dinner was Renata's idea. Originally, she wanted her parents and her father-in-law, it's just me. Daniel's mum passed 11 years ago to have a proper meal together without the noise of a large family gathering. She booked a place in Newcastle, a good restaurant near the waterfront, the kind of place with proper tablecloths and a wine list that comes in a folder. She mentioned it to me 3 weeks in advance, and I said I'd be there. What I didn't tell her was that 2 days before the dinner, Daniel called me. He sounded careful in the way he gets when he's working up to something. He asked how I was, asked about the tomatoes, asked about the Commodore, and then, after a pause, he said, "Dad, I need to tell you something." About the dinner on Saturday. He told me that Renata's parents had a plan. That Dennis had been speaking with a financial advisor, one of his old contacts from the Hunter Valley, about restructuring Renata's assets. That there was a conversation Dennis wanted to have with Daniel, at the dinner, in front of me, about what he termed Renata's long-term security. That the substance of this conversation was, as best as Daniel understood it, a proposal that Daniel consider a different career direction, with the suggestion that Dennis had contacts who could place him somewhere more strategically positioned, and that the subtext of the whole thing, the part Dennis had apparently made explicit to Renata's sister, who had told Daniel, was that Dennis viewed this as an intervention, a chance to redirect his daughter's life before, in Dennis's words, too much time passed. My son's voice was steady, telling me all of this, but I know my son's voice. Underneath steady was something quieter and more tired, the sound of a man who has been patient for a long time and is starting to feel the weight of it. Are you going to the dinner? I asked him. Yes, he said. Renata needs me there. Good, I said. So am I. Dad. He paused. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, I said. I want to. Tell me what time the reservation is. I wore the gray flannel shirt. I mention this because I made the choice deliberately and with full awareness of what I was doing. I also brought something with me in the inside pocket of my jacket. A plain white envelope. Unremarkable. The kind you'd buy in a pack of 50 from the newsagent. I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early. Dennis and Patricia were already seated. Dennis stood when I came in and shook my hand single-handed this time, which told me we were past the performance of warmth and into something more businesslike. Patricia smiled at my shirt in a way that didn't involve her eyes. Daniel and Renata arrived together a few minutes later. Renata looked beautiful and slightly tense in the way that people look when they love two groups of people who are about to be in the same room for a reason they're not entirely sure about. She hugged me and said quietly in my ear, Dad, whatever happens, just know I think you're wonderful. I squeezed her hand and said everything was going to be fine. We ordered. The conversation moved through the usual channels. The drive up from Sydney, the weather, the restaurant's reputation, whether the barramundi was sustainable. Dennis asked Daniel about work in the tone that I had now catalogued completely, the tone of a man raising a subject he considers beneath him for the purpose of making a point about it later. Daniel answered evenly. Renata asked her mother about the renovation they were doing to the back deck. I ate my bread roll and watched. It was about 40 minutes in, after the entrees had been cleared, that Dennis reached across and placed his hand flat on the table in front of him. Not on anything, just on the table. It was a gesture I recognized immediately as the physical equivalent of clearing your throat before a prepared statement. He said, I wanted to take the opportunity tonight, while we're all here, as a family, to have a conversation that I think is important, about the future, about making sure everyone is set up well. Renata said, Dad, I'm not criticizing anyone, Dennis said, with the particular patience of a man who has preemptively decided that any resistance to what he's about to say is an overreaction. I just think it's worth having an honest conversation. Daniel, you're a smart young man, talented, but I've been around long enough to know that logistics is a sector with a ceiling, and I want to make sure that you and Renata are thinking seriously about Dennis, I said. He stopped. He looked at me. I think it may have been the first time in 4 years that he had looked at me with full attention rather than the social minimum. I set my fork down. I picked up my water glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down with a quiet click against the tablecloth. I wonder if I could just say something first, I said, before you continue. If that's all right. He leaned back slightly, the lean of a man conceding the floor while making clear he considers it his floor. Of course, he said. I reached into my jacket and placed the white envelope on the table. I didn't make a ceremony of it. I just placed it there, the way you'd put your keys down when you get home. I've been sitting across from you at various tables for 4 years, I said, and I have genuinely enjoyed your company, Dennis. I have. You're a man who cares about his daughter. I understand that. I respect that. I am also a man who cares about my son, and I have been watching the situation that has developed around this family for some months now with a fair bit of attention. Dennis had glanced at the envelope and looked back at me. His expression was calibrated, politely attentive, with a faint undertone of condescension that I suspected he genuinely didn't know was visible. Of course, he said again. I want to talk to you about the logistics sector, I said. I only meant, I know what you meant, I said pleasantly, and I want to engage with it seriously, because it deserves a serious answer. I opened the envelope. Inside were 3 documents. I spread them on the table without fanfare. The first was a single page, a company overview. Whitmore Integrated Logistics, registered 1,998. Current operational footprint, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia. Fleet size, employee headcount, revenue for the last 3 financial years. The numbers printed clearly in 12-point font. I watched Dennis's eyes travel down the first page. The second document was the current organizational chart. At the top, Gerald Whitmore, founder and owner. Approximately halfway down the right branch, Daniel Whitmore, State Operations Manager, New South Wales, with a notation in brackets that said, Acting General Manager, Eastern Operations, as of 8 weeks prior, pending formal appointment. I had made that appointment 6 weeks earlier. I hadn't told Daniel yet. It had been sitting in HR waiting for me to pick the right moment. I decided this was the right moment. The third document was a recent industry report placing Whitmore Integrated Logistics in the top 12 freight and logistics operators in Australia by revenue, with a projected growth note for the following 2 financial years. I let Dennis read. I picked up my water glass again. Patricia had gone very still beside him. Renata was looking at me with an expression that I can only describe as the face of someone who has just been handed a piece of information that rearranges something they thought they understood. Daniel had gone slightly pale and was looking at the organizational chart with the focus of a man reading his own name in a document he didn't know existed. Dennis set the first page down. He looked at me. You own the company, he said. It wasn't a question, exactly. It was the sound of a sentence arriving from a place he hadn't expected. I built it, I said. Which is a slightly different thing, but yes. 19 years ago, I had 1 refrigerated van and a single contract with a small goods manufacturer in Campbelltown. Everything you're looking at came from that. Silence. Patricia reached for her wine glass. Dennis said quietly, Daniel works for you. Daniel was recruited through a standard process, I said. He applied for a position. He was assessed by people who had no knowledge of our relationship. He earned every role he has held on his own merit. I want to be clear about that, because it's true, and it matters. I paused. I may have made sure the advertisement reached the right channels. I may have watched his progress a little more closely than I watched other people's, but I did not manufacture his results. His results are his. I looked at my son. Daniel was looking back at me. His expression was complicated. There was something in it that was not quite confusion and not quite hurt. More like the feeling of standing in a room and realizing the walls are further away than you thought. I held his gaze for a moment and gave him the smallest nod. Later, I thought. We'll talk properly later. He nodded back. Barely. But he nodded. Why didn't you say anything? Patricia asked. The question was genuine. I think less strategic than her husband's manner, more simply human. Because it wasn't relevant, I said. When Daniel came to work in the business, I didn't want him to come as the owner's son. I wanted him to come as a person who had to prove himself. Because the only thing worth having is a position you've earned. And when he and Renata got together, it still wasn't relevant. What I have is mine to share with my family as I see fit. It's not a credential. It's not a status. It's just something I built. I turned back to Dennis. To his credit, and I want to be fair here, because I think fairness matters. Even when it's uncomfortable, to his absolute credit, Dennis Carver did not try to pretend. He did not reach for a reframe or a diplomatic redirect. He looked at the documents on the table, and then he looked at me. And I could see in his face something that I recognized because I have seen it in my own mirror a few times over 63 years. The look of a man who has been operating on a set of assumptions and has just been shown that the assumptions were wrong. It is not a comfortable look to sit with. I know that. So I gave him a moment. I owe you an apology, he said finally. His voice was different now. The local government polish was gone. What was left was just a man at a dinner table. You don't, I said. You formed an opinion based on what you could see. I don't hold that against you. Most people do the same. I paused. What I do want to address is the conversation you came here to have tonight. About Renata's security and Daniel's ceiling and where this family is headed. Dennis was quiet. Here is where this family is headed, I said. Daniel is about to be formally appointed General Manager of Eastern Operations, which he's been functionally performing for 2 months already. He doesn't know that, yet he's reading it for the first time on that piece of paper, same as you. I glanced at my son, who was still staring at the organizational chart with an expression that had now settled into something that looked remarkably like the steady face he wears in board meetings. Renata is his wife. She will be supported in whatever she chooses to do with her career and her life by a husband who is exactly as capable as you worried he wasn't, and by a family that has more behind it than the Commodore in the driveway suggested. Gerald Dennis started. I'm not finished, I said, pleasantly but clearly. I don't want to humiliate you. That is genuinely not what tonight is. You love your daughter. I understand that love, and I respect it. But I need you to hear this, because it matters for how this family functions going forward. I leaned forward slightly. The decisions in Daniel and Renata's life are Daniel and Renata's decisions, not yours and not mine. My job, the one I take more seriously than anything I have ever done in business, is to support without controlling. To be available without being directive, to trust them enough to let them build their own life without managing it from the outside. I held his gaze. I'd like to suggest that might be worth considering. The waiter chose this exact moment to appear beside our table. He was young, professional, and visibly uncertain about the atmosphere. Can I tell you about our dessert specials this evening? He asked, with the careful brightness of someone who has been trained to be cheerful regardless of circumstances. All 5 of us looked at him. He held his ground admirably. Renata looked at me. I looked at Renata. The corner of my mouth moved. Yes, I said. He told us about the desserts. We listened. Daniel ordered the chocolate tart. Renata ordered the panna cotta. I ordered the sticky date pudding, because I have never once in my life been in a restaurant with sticky date pudding on the menu and ordered something else. Dennis and Patricia ordered nothing, but Dennis asked for a coffee, which I thought was actually a reasonable sign. While we waited, Daniel turned to me. He had the look he's had since he was about 9 years old when he's working through something significant. A slight furrow between the eyebrows, the jaw set, the eyes doing the work. Dad, he said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. Always, I said. Did you give me my job because of who I am? I thought about that the way it deserved to be thought about. No, I said. I made sure you had a fair opportunity to be assessed. What you did with that assessment was entirely your own. I paused. You know what you did 3 months into the Parramatta warehouse project? You identified a routing inefficiency that had been sitting in the system for 4 years and costing the business about $200,000 annually. You fixed it without being asked, presented a full report to the operations team, and had it implemented in 6 weeks. I found out about it from your floor manager, not from you. That's why you have your job. He absorbed that. Nodded slowly. Monday, I said. We're sitting down properly. You and me. No father and son business. Just 2 people who run a company together. Being honest about what that means going forward. No more gaps. No more gaps, he said. And I am getting the windscreen fixed next week, I added. He laughed. A real one. From somewhere genuine. It was the best sound of the evening. That's man. A lac of answers. The desserts arrived. The sticky date pudding was, as sticky date pudding invariably is when made properly, an unreserved success. I ate it slowly and let the evening settle around me. Dennis and I didn't talk much more that night, but before he and Patricia stood to leave, he extended his hand across the table, single-handed this time but genuinely offered, which is a different thing from what it had been at the beginning of the meal. I misjudged you, he said. No dressing on it. Just the sentence. A dum-dum too. And he reigns. You judged what you could see, I said, and shook his hand. That's all any of us can do. The trick is being willing to revise. He held my handshake for a half-second longer than necessary. Then he nodded, helped Patricia with her chair, and they left. Not dramatically. Just 2 people going home with more information than they'd arrived with. Daniel, Renata, and I sat for a little while longer over our coffees. Renata reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said, Dad, you absolute dark horse. I said, I prefer the term strategic. She said, You wore the flannel on purpose, didn't you? I said, The flannel is always on purpose. Daniel was smiling into his coffee cup. I genuinely cannot believe you let me give you advice about the windscreen for 8 months while knowing all of this. The windscreen advice was still correct, I said. I do need to fix it. I drove home on the Pacific motorway with the city moving past and the rear speaker crackling faintly with the late-night radio. I thought about Dennis Carver sitting somewhere in Newcastle, revising a version of events he'd held with complete confidence until about 90 minutes ago. I felt no particular triumph in that. Revision is uncomfortable. It takes something from a person, even when it gives them something more accurate in return. I knew that feeling. I had been revised by life more than once, and it had never been painless. I only hoped that what he did with the revision was something useful. I thought about Daniel, driving back to Sydney with his wife, probably having a version of the conversation that I would never be fully party to and didn't need to be. He would be processing the promotion. He would be processing the full shape of what I owned and what that meant. He would be doing what he has always done, which is working through the significant things quietly and arriving, eventually, at something steady. I thought about what it means to build something and then spend years deciding how much of it to show and how much to keep quiet. I have thought about that question my whole adult life, and I still don't have a complete answer. What I know is that the showing has to be earned, not earned by the person doing the showing, earned by the situation. There are moments when it matters and moments when it doesn't, and the judgment about which is something you can only develop by paying attention for a very long time. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat. A message from Renata. It said, He told me to tell you that he's embarrassed and grateful, and that next time you come to Newcastle, He wants to show you the back deck renovation. I told him the bar is very low, but I think he means it. Also, Daniel says you're impossible and that he loves you. And I say the same. Both parts. I put the phone back on the seat and drove the rest of the way home in silence. My house in Penrith is modest. 3 bedrooms, a veggie patch along the back fence, a Hills hoist that I have never once used because I prefer the folding rack inside, and a garage that fits exactly one 2007 Holden Commodore with a cracked windscreen. The kitchen light was on because Daniel had come by the previous Tuesday, and, like his mother before him, had never once remembered to turn a light off when leaving a room. I unlocked the back door and stood in the kitchen for a minute in the quiet. Somewhere across the city, Dennis Carver was sitting with a revised understanding of a man he thought he knew. Somewhere on the M1, Daniel was driving toward his life with a clearer picture of the road it was on. And I was home, in my kitchen, in my flannel shirt, with a sticky date pudding settling comfortably and a windscreen appointment to book in the morning. There's a version of this story where I'm the hero and Dennis is the villain, and everyone learns their lesson neatly and goes home changed. I don't believe in that version. The truth is more ordinary and more interesting. Dennis was wrong, but he was wrong in a way that made sense given what he could see. The failure wasn't malice, it was incuriosity. He had stopped asking questions about a person he thought he'd already categorized. That is a failure of imagination, not character. And it's one that most of us are guilty of more often than we'd like to admit. If there's anything I'd want the people around me to take from all of this, it's probably just this. The most dangerous thing you can do when you meet someone is decide too quickly that you already know what they are. Certainty that arrives before curiosity always costs you something. Sometimes it costs you a business relationship. Sometimes it costs you a decade of a family's goodwill. Sometimes it costs you the chance to know a person properly before you've already filed them under the wrong heading and moved on. The flannel shirt is worth exactly $15. The watch keeps perfect time. The Commodore has done 312,000 kilometers and has never once left me stranded on the side of a road. And none of those things tell you anything meaningful about what I've built or who I am, any more than Dennis Carver's tie clip and his watch worn outside his cuff tells you anything meaningful about his heart. We are all of us more than the category. The job is to stay curious long enough to find out. I turned off the kitchen light and went to bed.